Tim Lott, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you.
So we're going to be talking primarily about your experiences of Zen meditation, or the Zen philosophy, really, particularly in the flavour of Alan Watts. But I wanted to start by getting a sense of why it formed such an important part of your life at a particular time. So I think we need to go through a little bit of your biography and understand what you felt you needed when you became particularly engaged with his thinking.
Okay, well, I didn't discover Alan Watts until I was in my 30s. At that point, I had a nervous breakdown, which I had when I was in my early 30s. Subsequently, I wrote a memoir about that breakdown. Not purely about that. It was also about my mother and growing up as a working class boy in London and class, as well as mental illness. But as part of that journey, I became friends in my researches with a woman called Dorothy Rowe, who seems to be largely forgotten nowadays, but was a wonderful, wise woman, and we became close friends. And she pointed me in the direction of Alan Watts. Dorothy Rowe, who some people might have heard of, was actually a kind of Buddhist, though she was kind of horrified to be described as such, because, as she used to say herself, I don't go around sticking gold flakes on the Buddha. I mean, she's just had a Buddhistic philosophy of life. And I didn't really understand what she meant by that. But she told me to go and read Alan Watts. And then I did start reading him, and I sort of became, I don't know if obsessed that's a bit of a sort of mental health word, isn't it? But I became fascinated by Alan Watts, and I thought he had all the answers, really, to things that had troubled me ever since I was a teenager. And he explained so much about being alive on this planet, which for me had been a torturous puzzle. And nobody seemed to talk about the things that bothered me. What bothered me, question mark? Well, I suppose it was that nothing seemed to make any sense, was what bothered me. And yet everybody walked around as if it did. And everyone sort of seemed absolutely sure of themselves and what they knew and what they thought. Whereas I just used to think, well, how can you be so sure? And everybody thinks everything different. So what makes you think you're right? And that's always been something that's tormented me. It's like, who gives me the pride with the capital P to say I'm right? So Alan Watts, after I had my breakdown, which was connected in a way with not having a sense of place or a philosophy to fall back on in some ways, because I was a classic product of modernity, I suppose, uprooted, atomistic, pleasure-seeking, lost in the moment, not having any particular personal philosophy, not religious, just drifting from one moment to the next and sort of blundering around, really. And I didn't like that feeling. I wanted a feeling of some kind of philosophy that I could believe in, or at least not find ridiculous. And most philosophies I found fairly incoherent, I suppose, and certainly religions. So anyway, on reading Alan Watts, Alan Watts, if I can, it came at the end of quite a fair list of people who I had been reading to try and get a sense of what was going on in my own mind and in the world.
Who else did you read?
Rollo May. I read The Existential Psychologists, Joseph Campbell, Jung. I was very fascinated. I'm a storyteller. I'm a novelist by trade. So, I'm very interested in stories, and therefore I couldn't help but be fascinated by the Joseph Campbell interpretation of storytelling and the mythic structures that were embedded in all human cultures, and that struck me as fascinating. So Jung and Joseph Campbell, I listened to this TV series called The Power of Myth that was shown on American TV when I was living in America for a few months. And that was interviews with Joseph Campbell. And that was terrific. It really excited me. And every now and again, I come across a thinker that really speaks to me. Not that often, and most thinkers I go, I sort of, kind of get it, but I don't really get it. But Alan Watts seemed to tick all the boxes and still does. I think he's a remarkable figure and an amazing man. And I wish I'd met him. I'm very grateful to him because what I liked about Alan Watts, I don't know, we haven't ever talked about Alan Watts and who he was. But what I loved about him was that he was he was very English in that, and by that I meant he had a sense of humor about himself, unlike most gurus.
Yeah, definitely.
He had a wonderful laugh. He liked things of the flesh. Sex and drugs and rock and roll was all ticks as far as he was concerned. He was, as far away from being ascetic as you could imagine. And he was he was very flawed. He was a drunk. He was a lousy father. He was married 3 times to other drunks. I mean, he was really he was not what you would call a saintly figure. And that attracted to me to him even more because, as he often said, you should never, there's nothing more dangerous than a saint, which I kind of agree with, really. I like flawed individuals because I think, because we're all flawed, and anybody who pretends they're not has got their head screwed on wrong, and I do think this sort of acceptance of our essential crooked timber is one of the things that I find very reassuring about Alan Watts. He's very forgiving in his philosophy. It's very accepting of who we are, and he's not in any way pious or moralistic. And he celebrates life and joy, and that's what I call a philosopher, not sort of not Kierkegaard or Plato sitting there philosophizing themselves to death. I mean, just people who have some joie de vivre, which he absolutely did.
Just before we go into his thinking and the things that particularly inspired you, I hope you don't mind, but in an article you wrote for The Guardian, you do go through the difficulties of your life, and they were not inconsiderable. I mean, your mother's death by suicide, being bullied as a child. I mean, they're challenging things for anyone to deal with. And at the particular time of your breakdown, I think in the article you mentioned that three people very close to you had recently died as well. So this was a sort of a cataclysmic time on top of a life that had already had sufficient hardship, really.
I suppose so. I mean, I wouldn't overstress that. I mean, it depends on how you look at it, doesn't it? I mean, I had loving parents. I had a stable home. I was enough food on the table. I was bored out of my mind, but I mean, I wasn't actually, when I read about some of the things that children go through when they're growing up, I mean, I think I was fairly unlucky. I mean, yeah, my big brother was a bit of a effer towards me, though I'm very close to him now and I love him very much. But at that time, we really didn't get on at all. And I was born with cancer, and that was not good. And I was operated on as a 3-day-old baby without anesthetic, as far as I can make out.
Yeah, they would have then. Yeah, it would have been without anesthetic.
So God knows what effect that had on me. But shit happens to everybody. I'm not trying to downplay it, but I mean, I'm simply saying that. I didn't have a sort of spectacularly, as I say, I read stories about people who are used by their grandfathers and buggered by the scoutmaster or whatever. I mean, I didn't have any of that really going on, which in some ways made being depressed worse, because I didn't really have any obvious reason to be depressed at any point. I mean, as things went, I was okay, and I didn't, have anything particularly to complain about.
I think I can empathize with that, because I would sort of say, I mean, I had some things that were wrong and hard and very challenging, and other things that were, really very positive in my upbringing, and on the whole, taken in the great scheme of things, hugely fortunate. And when I have suffered periods of depression, that has been one of the worst things. Is not only am I depressed, but I feel like a weak failure as well, because
Yeah.
there isn't really this.
That's one of the hellish things about depression. You often don't have anything in particular to be depressed about. You're just depressed. And so everyone goes, well, what are you so miserable about? You've got things pretty sweet. Thanks a lot. I mean, that doesn't feel good. Because you don't feel you've got any rights to feel unhappy. And yet you feel desperately miserable.
How did it impact your writing? Because you wrote, I think, first the memoir, and then subsequently you've been writing novels. How did the periods of of either depression or of the positive feelings, which we'll get to after you'd really fully embraced the Alan Watts ideas, how did that impact your creativity?
Well, all I can say about that is that depression is not good for creativity. I mean, it destroys creativity. It was only when I recovered from depression I could start being creative, because I had the spare energy. When you're depressed, all your energy goes into being depressed. There's nothing left over, or defending yourself against whatever you're defending yourself against. So on the one hand, there's no sense, excuse me, in which depression helped me to be a creative person. On the other hand, being a creative person, particularly as a writer, and I read a statistic recently that, I mean, there's a often repeated trope about creative people that they go crazy more often than other people, or suffer depression more than other people. Apparently, this isn't true. Except in the case of writers, novelists who are, and I understand why. It's an extraordinarily isolated, introverted, cut off kind of world in which you tend to feel quite separate from other people. You kind of are slightly outside of everything else, and it's quite isolating. And after all, you have to spend a long time in a room by yourself, grappling with something you don't know what to call, grappling to find something you don't know what you're looking for. I mean, it's very, very challenging job. I teach creative writing on Substack, and one of the things I try and press on my students is, don't mistake this for a harmless hobby. I mean, trying to write anything serious or serious with serious intent doesn't have to be serious. I mean, I try and be funny in my novels if I can be, but is no joke. I mean, it's a attempt to master imaginatively the world, and that's something most of us don't ever do, because we're too busy putting food on the table, going to work, planning our holiday, and building the kitchen extension. Novelists just sit there thinking, what the hell's going on? It's a bit like being a philosopher, only we're not quite as clever as philosophers. But I like to think we're sometimes wiser.
I wondered, this is somewhat tangential, but just thinking about it, I've done some creative writing courses and written some, fairly dreadful poetry and really dreadful prose. But one long piece that I wrote, and I remember I remember two things. One, that it did seem to have its own guiding principle of what happened, that there, and when it wasn't happening, I couldn't make it. It guided itself. But the other thing about it being so all encompassing, that all of the time this world and these characters were around me. And I wonder, if you're actually quite good at it, and it is really your job, not just something you're doing to as a exploration, if that sort of changes your experience of kind of consciousness and day-to-day living in some sense, because you're almost inhabiting two worlds simultaneously.
Maybe. I mean, when I read back some of my novels, which I rarely do, but occasionally I have to, because, well, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, some TV company wanted to buy the rights to one of my novels, and I couldn't remember the hell what the novel was about. So I had to go back and read it again. And on the occasions I've done it, I think whoever's written this novel is much cleverer than I am. And I genuinely feel that, that's almost someone else writes the novels, that they are of a caliber that is quite beyond my everyday communication and intellectual skills. And it's almost like entering a trance state.
Yeah, a demon. It's like a demon. Was it Plato or Socrates? One of them talks about the demon, having the demon as, and some people translate it as kind of soul or something. But it makes me think of that.
Yeah, daemon. I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the more I live and write and think, the less of a materialist I am. And I certainly, I believe in demons. I believe in gods and demons, and I believe in a spiritual universe without a doubt. I'm no longer what I was for most of my life, which was like, well, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, which struck me as one of those stupid precepts for life as I can possibly imagine. I mean, the whole scientific mindset is absurd as far as because you're told that it's like the only way of thinking, and everything else is woo-woo. Actually, the scientific way of thinking is unbelievably narrow-minded. So I've become, as I say, I'm not a materialist. I believe in gods and demons. I believe that those demons and gods are within you and within your unconscious, and what we call it the unconscious, but it used to be called God. It used to be called the gods. And you can't deny it. If you close your eyes, there are these little images and words are popping into your head. Where the hell do they come from? I don't know. Nobody knows. And suddenly this consciousness is here. What is this consciousness? So again, science has got no idea what the hell consciousness is. They like to pretend they do. They've got no idea what consciousness is. And, so my starting point for everything is I am conscious and I am here. And everything else follows from that. I think it's called phenomenology. But I think it's the idea that the most fundamental form of reality is the fact that you're conscious. And that is not a material thing. Thinking, imagining is not a material process. There's a wonderful book called The Mark by Maurice Nicoll, in which he talks about that the life is interaction between the visible and invisible. And what we don't, or what we forget or don't realize, is that human beings are invisible. They are completely invisible. Of course, I can see your eyes and flesh and face, but yourself is entirely invisible to me. It's within your consciousness. You are an invisible person, and I am an invisible person. Well, the fact that we are lunking around these pieces of flesh is neither here nor there. We are fundamental. Everything is an interaction between the visible world and the invisible world. And the invisible world is absolutely as real as the visible world. It's absolute, if not more real, than the bookshelves behind you or the table in front of you. It's real. It's not some kind of as the materialist would have it, some weird bit of steam that's let off as a byproduct of
epiphenomenalism.
Of the electrochemical processes. I mean, that's pathetic.
We could foray down this rabbit hole quite a long time, because I agree with so much, and also would like to sort of ask you about some other things, but it takes us away from the main subject of this. So if there's time at the end, we'll see if we can get back to consciousness, because it's something that's been discussed on this podcast quite a bit over the last month. But let's go back to Alan Watts and his particular flavor of Zen. And one of the things that you wrote in the article was his view of life having no intrinsic meaning any more than a piece of music has an intrinsic point. Life was, in Zen parlance, yugen, a kind of elevated purposelessness. How did that was that a consolation for you in feeling, oh well, it doesn't mean anything, or did it have some sort of a deeper significance in bringing a kind of meaning to meaninglessness?
Yeah, I mean, let me be completely clear. I don't think life is meaningless. What I think is that we don't know what the meaning is.
Okay.
And I think the idea, and to use the phrase precisely, the kind of elevated meaninglessness. It's not just, oh, nothing means anything. Again, that's plainly absurd. Of course, things mean things. Everything means something. If I, prod you in the throat, that means that you're going to be very annoyed with me. I mean, we're surrounded by meanings of love, anger, hate, desire, the gods within us, if you like. Meaning is everywhere. It's unavoidable. So, the traditional religious attitude was, everything is meaningful. We've now moved to this modern view that nothing has any meaning. And I think, the ancients are far more correct than we are. But what that meaning is inexpressible, and that's something also religious and spiritual teachers have really been saying since the beginning. The Taoists say, the Tao that can be spoken is not the Tao, and even I believe that's true of Christianity too. That really we cannot say what it is that of which life comprises or means. But that doesn't mean it doesn't mean anything and it doesn't comprise anything. It's just that our language and perceptions are not up to it, basically. If I spent my whole life trying to work out what life means. And if you said to me, well, what does it mean then, Tim? It's just like, I don't know. What am I going to tell you? I mean, what it means, go and read my 10 novels. That's what it means. That will start you off. Go and look at this poem. That'll give you a clue. But it's all clues. It's all hints. But you can't, in this very sort of mechanistic way, go, well, it means A this, B this, C this, and D this. That's part of the crazy mindset that we've got ourselves into.
It sounds like you're saying in some sense it's kind of emergent, but also going back to phenomenology, experiential. I was listening to an interview with Aboriginal political scientist Mary Graham last night, and she was talking about the dreaming, and she was saying that one person, the one white fella, had described the dreaming, and he had described it in a way of what it was like, and she appreciated that description, and somebody else had tried to make a representation of it as what it is, and she could see that as a kind of reified thing, but what it was like is something that's entirely different from the reified representation, however accurate that representation may be.
Well, when you say reified, can you just, what do you mean by that?
Something that's made into an object that can be looked at and analysed, and
that includes ceremonies and rituals.
No, that he had described it as if to turn it into the thing that is analysed, rather than an
Oh yes, I
experience
see
or
what
an
you're saying.
emergent, yeah,
Yeah,
rather
I see
than
what you mean. Yeah,
what it's like to be in that state.
yeah.
And if you're the meaning of that state is what it's like to be in that state, not something that you could describe externally. So you could
Exactly.
describe externally the sort of the carapace of dreaming, but dreaming incorporates this emergent experiential lived sense, lived and emotional and embodied qualities that you just couldn't represent.
No, and that sort of why I asked about ritual and ceremony is because in a way, ritual and ceremony and religious ceremony are all attempts to get at that thing that we can't
Yes.
speak words for, but they're very moving, these ceremonies, but we don't know why. Because words are a very, and this is one of the things Alan Watts writes about. He says that words are an incredibly limited and sketchy, what's the word? Not lateral exactly, but very one-dimensional way
Mm-hmm.
of describing experience. And we've become so obsessed with the way we symbolize meaning through words, as philosophers have. Words are incredibly inadequate. I'm a writer, but God knows, words are so inadequate for explaining what is taking place at any time. Reality is way beyond speaking. We can sort of hint at it, but an image in a film might make a massive impact on us, but we might not be able to say why. A man nailed to a cross might have a huge amount of impact on us, but we may not be able to say why. And yet, that image has taken the Western world through 2,000 years, and somehow that image of the cross and the man nailed, the crucifixion, has had this incredible, it's enough to build 10,000 churches. What does it mean? What the hell are all those churches doing there? It's a very peculiar thing. And I think life is very mysterious.
And so was it the sense that reading Watts allowed you to see that, to be more comfortable with that kind of esoteric, indescribable meaning of life, rather than always seeking a kind of understanding, a symbolic understanding that you could sort of put your finger on or aim towards?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he weaned me off of sort of logical positivism or rationalism. He weaned me away from. He was one. Others came after us, but he weaned me away from the idea. He used to talk about prickles and goo. Have you heard about this?
Yes, yes,
Yes, he
yes,
talks
yes.
about
I like
prickly
that.
people and gooey people, and the prickly people go, well, no, the world is exactly like this, and outside of this, there's nothing whatsoever. And the gooey people go, oh, I don't know, man, it's kind of freaky. I don't know, it's kind of weird. And he says, the world isn't prickles or goo, it's prickly goo. It's this sort of
Mm.
weird mixture, and we're constantly trying to nail. What I got out of what's primarily is like I was trying to nail the world down in my mind. And it wasn't until I read What's Understood you cannot nail the world down, because it's like trying to nail water down. Life is not quantifiable, it is not describable, it is not what we speak about. The map is not the territory. And he's very good on it, on really explaining how, and this is a Zen understanding, that life is, and this is obviously part of Zen discipline, is to try and experience the world without words or concepts. To say, to sit in a room and just, this is it, this is the experience, and I'm not going to comment on it, and I'm not going to form words about it. I'm not even going to form images about it. I'm just going to experience it, and that's being. And that was very powerful for me. The idea that what reality was could not actually be nailed down. That was one thing, and also he's wonderful. He's one of my favorite books of his is The Wisdom of Insecurity, which is got me to understand that there is no security. The whole idea of security is ridiculous. You're what seeking the metaphor he uses, which I think was rather wonderful, is seeking security in life is like, he said, well, you're pushed off a cliff when you're born, and holding onto a rock when you're falling is not going to make you any more secure. And I thought that's absolutely true. There's no security, and you're going to die. Basically, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going on. You don't know who you are. You don't know who the other person is. You haven't got a clue about anything, and you're going to die. That's your life. And so, what are you going to do with that? It is funny, but it's also terrifying. And people, in an attempt to deny the sheer intractability, the unknowability of things, devise patterns, pages, if you like, within which they live.
Yeah.
Because they can't bear the sheer unknowability and uncertainty of things. And what Watts taught me to try and do, though he was very against trying, Watts, he didn't believe in trying, he believed in allowing things to happen. All this, I'm gonna do it. No, he was very against that. The idea that you can, I forgot what I was going to say. It was probably very profound.
It was going to be hugely profound.
It really was, but it's gone. But that's that's uncertainty for you.
Oh, it really helps you to. We were on insecurity. Maybe this will sort of trigger
insecurity. We were about insecurity, yes, and the idea that that you could somehow make yourself secure, by clinging to a creed or a philosophy or a country or a religion, or a social group. These will all give you a false sense of security, but there's no real security.
And you were saying that it's while funny, it's also terribly frightening, and we try to sort of bulwark ourselves against the fear by all of these different methods, and ultimately all of those different methods are no use.
Well, they can be useful if you can get away with it, but the trouble is, sooner or later, reality has a habit of sneaking up behind you and whacking you over the head, and then what do you do? I think a lot of people get away with all kinds of silly belief systems, and sometimes, perhaps quite often, it carries them through life. I can't do that. No. I mean, perhaps I wish I could, but I can't. I find there's something about my mind that is always going, nah, I don't know, that doesn't really make sense. And that's not a very comfortable, and it's not a very comfortable thing for other people to be around. I mean, I lost a lot of friends, not by being mean to them, by just going, I don't know why you believe that, or I don't know why you think that. Why do you think that? And that is enough for some of them to absolutely freak out, because they've actually never thought about it, and most people's beliefs are picked up like little motes of fluff on your jumper when you're walking past a static cone. We think we sold this myth that we're independent individuals, but we're not. We're put together by society, by history, by media, by advertising, by a family. To think independently, which I suppose has always been my goal, is a very hard goal, because you are not only are you made out of other people and other things and other processes, but also thinking for yourself, although it's much advertised as a good thing. In fact, most people don't like it. They don't like being around people who think for themselves, actually. They like to think they do, but they don't. They like people who think for themselves within a certain very small spectrum of the agreed assumptions. I live in a very, very stereotypical liberal middle class area of northwest London, and everybody believes exactly the same thing as far as I can make out, and they all think they're very individual and brilliant, and they're clever people, they're not fools, but actually, if you sort of say to them, well, I don't know, maybe open borders isn't a great idea. I mean, you can have like a hysterical fury coming at you. It's like whatever. The fact is there is a certain it's nothing about it being independent and free thinking. They are just as tribal as a West Ham supporter, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, there's no difference. And if you raise your voice against the mob, and there are clever mobs as well as dumb mobs, you're not going to make yourselves very popular. That's why I have no friends and do interviews like this, just to have someone to talk to for a few.
Oh, well, it's nice for me to have someone to talk to. I mean, I have a few friends, but not that many. One of this is it kind of aligns with one of the other things that I'd drawn out of the article, that you said, you wrote that Watt saw his job via Zen philosophy to teach you to think clearly so that you could see through conventional thinking, as you're saying, to a place where your mind could be at peace inside a culture that could have been designed to generate anxiety. So do you feel, I mean, is your mind, it sounds as if your mind was at peace when you went through this initial period with Watt, because you do say in that article that you felt that you experienced a state of satori for and that kind of enlightenment for pretty much a year, and then that sort of faded away. So can you give us a sort of sense of that sort of narrative arc?
Well, it's hard to say. All I can say is that I feel it very much at the moment. I feel very much in the flow. I don't worry about anything. I sleep well. I wake up feeling fine. I'm not, emotionally agitated by anything. I feel I take things in my stride. So that's quite close to that, that ideal state. But a couple of months ago, I felt very differently. I felt very upset and about something personal. And I was not feeling good, and I didn't feel at ease, and I didn't feel, what should we say, equilibrium. Nothing dangerous, nothing, that would approach depression or anxiety, but I just didn't feel at ease in the world. And I have a very good, actually a Zen psychotherapist who is a really terrific guy, who has helped me enormously over the last 10 years. And he had a very simple solution, which I have tried before, but, it actually does work. He just said, well, you should try meditating. And I thought, yeah, all right. I used to meditate and I stopped. I started meditating again, and Bob's your uncle. I've been fine ever since. I mean, just by sitting still for, twice a day, 20 minutes has done wonders for me. So, it's a slightly banal prescription. But along with a lot of other things, meditation, therapy, can all, reading the right books, can all help. So, yeah, just lately I felt in a very good place. And on top of being, I don't know if I've mentioned this, or you've mentioned it, or anyone's mentioned it, but I also was diagnosed with ADHD about 7-8 years ago. And that really did explain a lot about my life and the depressions I suffered and the way I lived my life and the mistakes I'd made in my life. Because, I kind of had this little motor running inside me all the time, but it was just very hard to be still. I was always, mentally active. And I've learnt, that meditation is one of the ways you can help compensate for ADHD. Yeah.
Two things there. In fact, I might have just forgotten one of them, but one of the things. Oh, yes, in your article, you did say that you credited the ADHD with leading to some disastrous media appearances. And so I was thinking to myself, well, I wonder what's going to happen here. But the other thing was, I noticed in the Eon article, which we will link to in the show notes, that you wrote that Alan Watts dismissed Zazen, dismissed the sort of sitting. So at the time, right back in your initial exploration of him, you presumably didn't meditate then?
Yeah, a bit, but I mean, it's not that Alan Watts was against meditation.
Ah.
He just was against Zazen, which he called the aching back school of Zen, which is like the more you can make your back ache, the better, the more spiritually elevated you were. And his answer to that was, well, a cat sits until he's bored and then gets up and walks away. And the point about meditation, he says, and he's right, is it's not meant to be a task. It's meant to be a pleasant experience. People go, I've got to go and meditate. And you see these sort of things that, meditate for higher productivity. It's kind of like, it's kind of missing the point. The point of meditation is that it has no point, and until you sort of understand how to live with pointlessness, that's what meditation's there for. It's to make you think there's nothing wrong with just sitting here. I'm just sitting here. Okay? Got nothing else to say. And in this culture we live in which we are constantly urged to go and do things, ideally as part of a group, to be able to say, I'm just sitting here, is quite a powerful thing, I think. So no, Watts was not anti-meditation. He just didn't make a fetish of it.
I see.
He's made quite a few videos, I think, about meditation and how to meditate, which I suspect he made for money as much as anything else. But I feel the same. I meditate when I feel like meditating. At the moment, I feel like meditating, so I'm meditating twice a day. But I probably won't. I'll probably stop again. It's not like I'm saying you must meditate. None of that. None of these sort of cast iron principles hold water for very long. But I have found meditation helpful.
You mentioned earlier about the sort of scientific method having this kind of negative impact on the way that we think, and this idea of sort of pointlessness seems to me to be or that kind of elevated sort of pointlessness without the meaninglessness. It seems to be kind of aligned with this idea of sort of imprecision, of ambiguity, of both and rather than or. And I liked that one of the points that you brought out was what affirmation of the essential connectedness of things. And you write, we live in an imprecise world. Nature is extraordinarily vague. Science promotes the idea of hard, clear, brute facts, but some facts are soft. That gets back to the prickly and the gooey, I guess. A cutting up attitude to life gives us dead knowledge, not live knowledge. And I like that idea of live knowledge, and I think that for a writer as well, live knowledge surely must be a lot more fruitful to consider than dead knowledge.
Well, to be knowledge, it has to be live. I mean, the moment you grasp it, it is dead. In a strange way. I mean, this is one of those things I think is quite hard to describe, but. And you have to get into epistemological discussions about, what it means to know things, which I'm not qualified to do. But I think when I think of times in my life when I've known things at some very deep level, it's definitely not, I know that E equals MC squared, perhaps that's a kind of sort of deep knowledge. It's some kind of connection with your unconscious mind again, which again, I would not hesitate to also call God. I don't believe in a Christian God, but I'm definitely a deist. I mean, I definitely think we are surrounded within and without by something. I don't know what to call it, but it's there. Of course it's there. It's within me, and it's within you, and it's within everything else. I have no doubt about that anymore. Um, uh, so that's, I suppose, what I mean by living knowledge, and knowledge is something you kind of have to be. You don't go out and find it. You have to kind of be receptive to it. I think. Yes, that's the word. You have
Open
to
to
be
it.
receptive to it.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. When considering the because I think, reading through Alan Watts's books and looking at the recordings of all those different lectures and so forth that are on YouTube, and there is a vast treasure trove of that on YouTube. When you compare that with the impact of having therapy and the impact, I think, that you mentioned in the article, medication as well, do you think they all three are equally valuable to you, or valuable in different ways for different aspects of of living in this difficult world?
Therapy, medication, and Alan Watts.
Yeah,
Those three things.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
And
you're
meditation, I suppose. Medication.
yeah. Meditation, medication,
Yeah.
medication. Yeah. Well, you put your finger on it, and they're all useful in their different ways. I mean, I think they're all valuable. You know, trying to find your way through all the possible ways of thinking about the world is very hard, because who the hell is Alan Watts? Nobody knows who he is. This, to me, is this spiritual genius, but most people haven't got a clue. Ask 100 people in the street who Alan Watts is; they haven't got a clue. I mean, even amongst intellectuals, so-called, most people don't know who Alan Watts is. It's quite a esoteric niche piece of knowledge, you might say. And this is always the surprising thing to me, because these quite marginal figures, to me, are very powerful. Dorothy Rowe, another one who's not really known by anybody, not taken notice of. But it's not the big names. I mean, Freud, was obviously a genius. Jung, I think, more so. And I've been reading a very good book of Jung's pretty impenetrable, but I've been reading a book of his speeches and essays, and that's really good, and that helps.
Which one's that?
It is called Jung Speaks, and it's all his interviews, all his public lectures, and it's quite a rare book. I think I had to pay 30 quid or something, 40 quid maybe, from America for it. But it's the only book I've read that really has a satisfactory way of explaining what he was going on about, which wasn't always very clear. And he certainly impresses me. And of course, he is more like a household name. But Joseph Campbell is somebody who is known more now because of his impact on storytelling. I would have to say, controversially, I'm a big fan of early Jordan Peterson.
I was as well. Yeah.
Until he went Doolally, I think his early stuff was quite brilliant. And I've been watching it again recently. His Maps of Meaning lectures are quite superb, and he's to me one of the most important, the most important living thinker, but who's somehow shot himself in the foot by getting involved in these ridiculous culture war arguments. And they've torn him to pieces, I think.
And I think he's reacted to it by sort of pushing himself further in one direction than he would naturally have gone.
Reacted to it very badly. I think he's. I mean, in a way, I'm not surprised. I mean, my God, he came in for a sort of beating. And I suppose it was what I said earlier, is that people who speak their own mind, even if they're as charismatic and clever as Jordan Peterson, and do not make themselves popular. And he was. I mean, of course, he had many acolytes, of which I was one. And I met him many times, and had conversations with him many times, and found him a remarkable man. But it's so sad to watch him being, as it were, possessed by demons, if you like, is how he would put it, I think. I mean, I remember asking him in an early interview, saying, "Well, aren't you worried that all this fame and attention is going to ruin you?" And he said, "Well, yes, I'm very aware. I'm very careful. I know how this could go to your head. Now look where we are, the sort of ranting lunatic on YouTube channels. I mean, it's so sad because I think he's become exactly the person all his detractors said he was. And I think he was an incredible thinker, and I think he's lost his way, and he was kind of crucified, I think, and unfairly, I think, very unfairly, but he's ended up in this place of sort of, the hall of villains to the liberal sensibility of some corners, and we're in an era of groupthink, and people like Jordan Peterson don't go down very well. But when I listen to him now, which I don't, but when I have, I think, well, I can see your point. I'm not talking his point. I mean the people who hate him, because I think he is a dick, just like and then I think, but he's not. He's a really smart guy who actually taught me a lot. Particularly about storytelling. Actually, as I say, I'm a novelist, so his understanding of storytelling is incredibly powerful. But also the idea that it's the fundamental question: how do we make meaning of the world? Why do we believe what we believe? And that's an incredibly crucial question, because he starts off. I was rewatching the Maps of Meaning. He was saying, well, he starts off. He started studying in the days of the Cold War, Russia versus America, and just all these nuclear weapons pointed at each other, and just thinking, what's going on here? Why are these ideas, worth destroying the world for? And it's a good question. It's a very good question. And that's really what he delves into: why we believe things with such passion, often without much reason. And ironically, that's what's brought him down. A lot of people
that is ironic,
without much reason. There you go.
Anyway. And what about Ian McGilchrist? I imagine that he might be of interest to you.
Oh yeah, I think he's brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, yes, he is fantastic. I was watching in a conversation he had with a guy who I didn't know before, but that found fascinating, called Patrick Curry, who's written about enchantment. And and enchantment, looking at enchantment and art is his recent book, where he's looking, I think, more at paintings, but he's got a couple of chapters on literature apparently, but that, I think, McGilchrist is absolutely fascinating. That really sort of speaks to me.
I agree, and there are wise men out there, but who knows who they are? I know who they are, perhaps.
Some of them
know who they are, but most people haven't got a clue who they are. When asked who the most intelligent man in Britain was a few years ago, the wisest man in Britain, I think they came up with some, it was Richard Dawkins or something, which is kind of hilarious.
I wouldn't have minded if it was David Attenborough.
No, but he's a scientist, and he's nobody, including me, is not going to speak a word against David Attenborough. But he's not somebody who, probably given his years of biological training, there's only so many ways you can think about the world, even if you're David Attenborough, and I think the idea of thinking too far outside the box for someone who is trained in scientific rigor to such an extent is going to be a challenge. But I don't know enough. But I'm a big admirer of his, of course. Who wouldn't be? But yeah, I mean, clearly a wise man. But like you said, Ian McGilchrist, walk down the street, ask 100 people who Ian McGilchrist is. No one's got a clue.
I think for someone of, well, it sounds as if for someone of your particular characteristics, and I think I sort of share a lot of it, that this idea of having a sense of, what is what is the way I'm going to make sense of life? I mean, I don't particularly like the idea of having a sort of like a narrative arc to my own experience, in that, I went through this dark night and that gave me these strengths, and then I picked up my Excalibur sword. I mean, I'm not particularly into that sort of narrative view of therapy. But I do have a really strong searching, questing for having this idea of what you seem to have found, is by bringing together Alan Watts and your own thinking and the gods and demons, a view of, well, this is how I understand life. And I think it seems to me that, partly that's coming through Watts, and a lot of it through thinking, through meditation, through conversations with Zen psychologists, through being in a calm enough place, assisted perhaps by medication, that, that actually is the therapeutic tool. The therapeutic tool is like the emergent quality of all of those things, which comes together in a kind of life philosophy. Or am I just being too florid about that?
I don't know about Floyd, but I'm not quite sure what it is you're saying. I mean, yeah, all those things have their role, will be one way of putting it.
But don't they all come together to give you this sense of, and this is how I,
Yeah, I mean,
this is
yeah.
my vision of life, as it were, and that itself is what's therapeutic.
Well, at least I have a vision of life. And
Yeah.
I think what always bothered me is I didn't have a vision of life.
Yes.
I didn't have any idea what was going on.
Yeah.
I didn't. Nothing anybody said made any sense to me. None of the thinkers I read had any impact on me. I read books on Buddhism and thought, well, this is a load of rubbish. I mean, because I was reading the wrong books. Because most people have got a complete misunderstanding of what Buddhism is, just as they've got a complete misunderstanding of what Zen is. And it took me a long time to work out the philosophy behind these things, which usually get turned into religions of one kind or another. But to actually go to the root and understand, and I'm not any great intellectual, I need to find people like Watts who are capable of explaining to me, these difficult ideas, and I think that's a lifetime's job, is trying to find the people who speak to your experience. And the people I have found, be it Joseph Campbell, be it Jung, be it Alan Watts, be it Dorothy Rowe, be it Jordan Peterson, they're people who speak to my experience. And so I read them and I think, yes, that's the way it is, but no one else is saying this, and that is incredibly powerful. And you sort of build layer by layer a sense of, shall we say, realistic awareness. Let's put it no more strongly than that.
And so if we were sort of considering that quite a lot of the people who might be listening to this might be psychologists in training, or people with an interest in sort of therapy, is there anything that, if you were speaking to psychologists, that you might say, well, here's something that you can suggest to clients, or here's something that you can that might be useful for you to consider when dealing with clients, out of all this experience of dealing with depression, dealing with ADHD, and forging a kind of independent path through it?
That's a really difficult question.
Yes, it was a really difficult question. I threw it at you right at the end.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm not a therapist, and I'm not, although I know a lot of therapists. And that's there's a huge amount of training involved in therapy to achieve just that, I suppose, professional training and so forth. I want to stick with this because it's a really good question. I wonder what I would say to a therapist. All I can say is what I would say. I had several therapists before I settled on mine. And what I would say I love about him is that he tells me nothing. He never gives me advice. He never tells me what things are or should be. He just asks me interesting questions. That's all he does. And that interesting question might be, well, why do you think that? Or it might be, well, why do you feel so bad about that? And it, really nothing more than that. But that's very powerful. And if I had anything to say to therapists, you be humble, be very humble in front of a human being, because human beings are complex creatures. And if you think you know what the hell is going on inside of a human being, check yourself. You are on the same journey to try and understand the most mysterious of things, people, and don't get it into your head because you're a therapist. You have any more than me as a novelist, that I have some magnificent insight into what human beings are. They're a mystery, a deep, impenetrable mystery, which does not mean you cannot help them. You can. And I haven't, having said that, I have sat down to dinner with half a dozen actually psychoanalysts, not psychotherapists. And interestingly and shockingly to me, none of them thought they were doing any good. And I said, well, why are you doing it then? There was a kind of like slight, there was a long silence. It was like, just like it was like a joke amongst them. They were making all this money out of, but none of them really thought they were doing any good. And I just thought, well, stop fucking doing it then. Because you're just stealing from people. And if you can't think you're helping people, why do it? You've got to be thinking. And I'm enormously grateful to my therapist. He helps me and has helped me, and there's no doubt about it. And if you're a therapist and you don't think you're helping your clients, well, I would stop wasting both of your time.
And time being, I've already taken up more than an hour of your time. So unless there's anything else that you particularly wanted to say, we'll of course put contact details for your Substack and how people can find your writing blog, and also links to the 2 articles that we've been referencing. But is there anything else that you particularly wanted to say before we sign off?
Anything I want to say? See, I feel I've got a great opportunity here, and and yes, I'm going to flop it because if you haven't got anything out of what I've already said, then there's nothing I can really add to it. I don't think. But make peace with uncertainty would be my motto. And death, of course. Okay. Easy enough.
No problem there then.
No problem there then.
Tim Lott, thank you so much for being on Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. All right. Bye-bye now.